All right, well, let me screen share my side and other questions that we have come up. Let's see, there we go. And can you all see the slides?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. Okay, awesome. Okay, so for this end, I've got a couple of topics to go through. Shout out to the Serverless Guru marketing team for making a Halloween themed slideshow out of our slideshow template. So it's so nice, like there's a little spider there too. Yeah, so getting straight in, a little bit about Serverless Guru. Basically, we've been working with clients since late 2018, helping them build serverless applications, doing training, integrating into teams, working shoulder to shoulder with you as you adopt serverless. And that's what we do today. And we've expanded out to much bigger clients. We work with high growth startups and enterprise companies that are looking to just jump straight to the benefits right away. And that's what we kind of help with. A little bit about me, founder of Serverless Guru, was kind of an idea in 2017 and then kind of finally visualized or realized in late 2018. I do a podcast called the Talking Serverless podcast. If y'all haven't seen that, definitely would recommend. I sit down with people. I've had Tavi on once or twice, potentially twice. And we've talked with serverless practitioners in a space that are doing really awesome work. And I've used that in my own journey as like a learning resource, both every time I interview somebody and also like Jeremy Daly or Yan Kui's podcast are really good too in the serverless space. Also made a course back in 2019 called the Serverless Zero to Paid Professional course. It's got about 93 videos at the moment on building infrastructure as code with serverless. And you get to see how I kind of think about building serverless applications from like a beginner level up, starting with like Node.js as our programming language. Also, something to flag down is I started my serverless journey in the innovation engineering department at Nike in late 2017. That was super exciting. I got to start really putting together some more startup experience prior to Nike with serverless framework and infrastructure as code and AWS development into practice, and then took a lot of those lessons and then started doing consulting on the side until eventually Serverless Guru sprung up. Again, shout out to the marketing team for taking some of these images and just making them look really cool. So the first one up here is Children of the Cold Start, the original that started it all, right? So first up, when we thinking about cold starts, by and large, a lot of the cold start things have been addressed. There's been a lot of tutorials, content, things around it, including like outside like frameworks, and just it's become a lot more mature. But when it first started off, I remember having to build like scripts that would, like for instance, use like a CloudWatch cron job, and it would ping my function and like try to keep it warm. And you'd have like a section of it, like if it's a warmer CloudWatch cron, then just exit out a Lambda function, and did that for a while, and that didn't really work. And so now, kind of the way that we like to think about it at Serverless Guru is choosing a good programming language that plays nicely with serverless. And so I put here Node.js, Python, over potentially something like Java or C#. And I also put in parentheses their workarounds here. Somebody from our team at Serverless Guru, Almir, specifically flagged down that there are actually ways to make Java and C# work, and we do that for clients as well at Serverless Guru. I don't have it directly in front of me. Maybe I do. Yeah, so for Java, for instance, you can basically use something called grailvm.org. And that was something that was flagged down by Almir, and that kind of helps with things. Also with C#, there is something called a read to run format to compile your assemblies. And I can give more information about that afterwards as well. So you can make Java and C# work, with the caveat being that you might have to do a little bit more work than something like Node.js or Python. I didn't include all the programming languages like Rust and Go and so on, but I would recommend starting with Node.js. And if you're already working with Python, Python's good too. One of the biggest reasons why Node.js originally was because most of the documentation tutorials were geared towards Node.js. If you're doing like Rust with Lambda, the amount of content that you have to use is much less, right? Or like Go even. And so you kind of have to take the Node.js tutorials and then map them over to Go. Same thing for like Java or C#. And from my experience, that extra process is just something to think about. With the caveat being, again, another caveat, right? That if your team is like rockstar Java developers and you have the serverless knowledge and you're trying to move something over, like migrate it, then it could be easier to kind of just lift and shift with Java and move that over versus rewriting everything from scratch. And so there is kind of a thing where you can kind of do something like that, like a hybrid approach where you're building new things in Node.js and you're also moving over Java things just to fit into that workflow. So also something is reducing a Lambda package size to less than 5 megabytes. This has to do with the underlying container. And just by having it less than 5 megabytes, you have much smaller cold starts that will take place, if at all. So I would say caveat there too. And so one thing that we do as well is we utilize packaging tools like Webpack. And we've been able to see with some of our clients, one of them was 20/10. And you can read a case study on that on the serverlessguru.com website. And we basically helped work with them to optimize how they were building serverless applications. It had already existing stuff built, and they just kind of came through, reorganized stuff, and then also try to tackle making the deployments faster and also lowering the package sizes for Lambda. And by using just a Webpack plugin with the serverless framework, you can get like 80% smaller packages. And why that happens is it basically creates a dependency tree, and then only what's being used by the Lambda function is going to stay. Everything else gets cut out. And you can also do things like minification and uglification to lower it further there too, depending on what you want to accomplish. Also, I would say limit your third-party dependencies. So this is just one thing that when you're working with something like a virtual machine, maybe even a container, you might just go, oh, just include it, right? Like the request library or some other library that's out there. And what you end up doing is every time you come across some problem, you just include the library, and you end up building this huge amount of dependencies for your application to run. And I think in a serverless context, you probably want to take a little bit more caution with this. And yeah. Also, you can leverage AWS built-in functionality to reduce invocations. This first bullet here was pointed out by Mohammed on our team. And he was basically saying that one way that you can do this as well is that you can put up request validation at the API gateway level, and that will stop malform requests. And it also reduce the amount of application code that you have to write. And so every time that you write code, you then have to test the code, you have to debug the code, and it's just all this extra overhead. And so there are built-in functionality from AWS, like for instance, request validation here, where if you can do that filtering at that level, then you don't have to even write that code or test that code downstream. And that's nice because every time that it stops the request at the API gateway level, it never invokes the Lambda. And so there's a cost saving factor there. And there's also a cold start saving thing there as well, which was kind of an out of the box thinking there from Mohammed there. Next up, we have 28 Lambdas later. So brief history of the cloud. As we all know, we went from data center to virtual machines to containers, and now we're at cloud functions. Each iteration is a smaller form factor, having more focus on the product, more focus on the things that the customer sees and interacts with, and then just more levels of abstraction beneath it. So when we use cloud functions, when we use Lambda on AWS, we still are interacting with or AWS is interacting with a container and a virtual machine and a data center underneath, but we don't have to worry about that and take that on to our head. And I remember going into some early clients with Serverless Guru where they were running their own data center. It was a very small setup, but they had to worry about all those underlying layers. And so it was just like I was being looped into conversations around that side of it because it was a smaller company and not focused on the actual product development side, just because things downstream were breaking or needed to be updated. Progression wise, the way that I started thinking about this earlier was, maybe you have one virtual machine and obviously, of course, put a little asterisk there. And then you have 10 containers. So, and from that 10 containers, you might have 100 Lambdas, right? And so as you move from virtual machines to containers to cloud functions, the amount of things that you have to manage goes up dramatically, right? And that could be with DynamoDB, with SQS, and all these other services that now have to exist in separate pieces and then be stitched together, right? And so how does that mapping work? And how do we draw those connections? And how do we even know what's going on, right? It's just too many things. And so some strategies to manage this. The first one would be investing into optimizing the developer experience. I've seen people on Twitter start calling it DX, and so I added that in too. I'm not even sure if I got that correct there. But one thing that we've been able to do that we saw success in is writing helpful scripts. So for instance, let's take an example where you build a CRUD API and you're going to secure that CRUD API with a Cognito JWT token, right? And so every request is going to be authenticated. Well, when you don't have that UI side up yet, maybe you want to log in and be able to hit and test those API endpoints, but you need to have that JWT, right? And so it can be quite a convoluted process to get that JWT. And so one thing that I wrote maybe like a couple weeks ago is just a script where you run like, it was a bash script, but you could do this with the AWS SDK as well. And it just hits the cognito user pool, passes an email and password. It signs up, confirms sign up, and then signs in. And it takes about like 5 seconds, and you can get a JWT back, and you plug that into Postman or Insomnia, and you can start testing that authenticated API. And so things like that, and then you hand that over to 20 or 30 developers, and the process to get the JWT before might have been like 15 minutes, and it expires every hour. And you think about them developing all day, that's 5 times, whatever that looks like, right? And it ends up being a lot of time, times 30 developers. And so things like that are also a lot of cost savings, because when you think about where did the cost come from, it's not only the cloud, it's also your engineers. And so the more you can make them efficient, the better off we are. Also templates. And so when we think about like writing, serverless applications, and we have Lambda functions mixed in there, and we're doing things like least privilege IAM, all that stuff has some level of infrastructure as code, like YAML configuration. You could be using a different framework, but I'm just going to assume that for this. And with each one of those little things, that's all stuff that you have to debug and troubleshoot, get the syntax correct, fix it, and so on. Well, if you have templates that are helping you with that, it becomes a lot easier to build new stuff. One thing to jump into as well is that 100 Lambda functions, all these different services, how do you manage it? That's where having app hierarchies is very important, and also documenting the request flow. Another thing would be using consistent naming conventions. So this is a very easy one. This would be like the low-hanging fruit. When I go into the AWS console and I have hundreds of Lambda functions, I want to be able to correlate those and then filter them down, right? So if I use the base naming path of like my-app-prod, and then anything after that, like that -x, that could be Lambda function A, and then Lambda function B, Lambda function C, and so on, all the way down the list of 100. And that allows me to filter through, especially if I have, my app prod 1, my app prod 2, my app prod 3, and so on. And I have Lambda functions underneath each one of those, overarching apps. Also providing team trainings on debugging, deploys, common issues, infrastructure as code, service organization. Any learnings that you've gotten from building serverless applications and managing what that kind of looks like, all that stuff is very important. Sometimes we focus purely on like the application code side, or maybe like how to trace a function or something like that. But there are a lot of like developer experience things, or like when an error happens, what are like the 4 steps that I start doing, right? Do I go to CloudWatch logs? Do I go to CloudWatch insights? Do I open up Dashbird? What does that look like? And teaching the developers on the team how to do that, and really putting time and investment into thinking about optimizing that side of it, it has huge downstream impact. Next up, we have the train to production. So on this one, I put hardened ops setup. And so very important here, monitoring, logging, alerting, tracing, all the things that Dashbird specifically specializes in. So shout out to Dashbird here. You can leverage a third party to jumpstart it, e.g. Dashbird. You can also go the alternative route where you build things out yourself. And it all kind of depends on the context of the company, right? So same thing as, do you leverage Java or Node.js and so on? Do you lift and shift, or you just rebuild everything from scratch? All that stuff requires, your own analysis to break down. Also, a huge thing here is response plan. So we've had things happen where some big break takes place on a production project, and then we have to start going through those steps. And immediately, not a fire drill, it's a real fire. First things that go through is, one, how do you identify the problem? So where do you look? Ideally, you're alerted. Who do you ping, right? How do you roll back this problem that just took place? When do you escalate it? At what point is it more of a problem or less of a problem? And how do you know that? And you can create a list of scenarios like this and then war game it, right? So run a tactical scenario and then try to figure out how you would go about it, and then document that, harden the process, and then give that to your team. Because the one thing that you don't want to happen is for an alert to go off and people don't know how to handle the alert, or no alerts to go off and then get flagged down by customers. That's probably the worst case scenario. Not have a rollback strategy in place. And so then you rolled out this new code, it started breaking, everybody went off to get drinks at the end of the day on a Friday, and now people are being called back to try to fix things, but they don't have a strong rollback strategy. And so we're going in and trying to just like re-upload code that was uploaded before, hoping that it's just going to work as like a Hail Mary thing. And none of that stuff is good. Release strategy wise, this is also super important to think about. So investing into Canary or blue-green deploys. And I use the word invest, and I keep using the word invest because all of this stuff takes time to put into place. And your company has to understand that to do this stuff effectively, you can't skip that process. Like, you do actually have to sit down, understand how it works, and then actually build it out. And to do this properly, you really do need to take time. So Canary or blue-green deploys, whatever works best for your company. And that will definitely help with making recovery easier because, for instance, with like blue-green, if you deploy a separate version and you swap it over, things happen, you can swap it back. That's great. Canary, if you're slowly rolling it out and something happens, you can slowly roll it back out or roll it back in, and that's also good. And then, of course, automate as much of that process as possible. And that improves MTTR. MTTR is mean time to recovery. And so the faster that you can get this stuff working, the better. So if a problem is seen, then roll it back, stop it from being moved through. And of course, you can set up different accounts so that as it's flowing to the development, to QA, and so on, you're doing more aggressive tests, like end-to-end tests, smoke tests, and so on, to identify problems so it never gets to production. And then if it does, let's use a release strategy that's really strong, and let's have automation in place so that it's not an individual developer to click buttons. All right, next up we have aliens. So aliens, this is being attacked from the outside, right? So we have security in serverless. What do we do? What we like to do at Serverless Guru is we leverage a serverless framework plugin to control access at the infrastructure as code level. I believe it's called serverless IAM role per function. And what this does, it allows us to lock down the access to the Lambda function to just what it needs. So if it's doing a DynamoDB scan or a DynamoDB query, that's all we're going to lock it to, just a DynamoDB query. It's not going to have all of DynamoDB permissions. We're not going to use star patterns. And to do this effectively at the infrastructure as code level, we leverage that plugin. Also, AWS account isolation. Oh, let me dial back. Actually, why it's important to have that plugin is that by default with the serverless framework, when you write like 5 Lambda functions instead of one, serverless framework infrastructure as code template, and you define it using a built-in serverless framework IAM stuff, and asterisk, if they updated it in the past like a month or something, this might be outdated. But what you would do normally is you would define it at like kind of the root level, and it would apply to all 5 Lambdas inside of that service. Well, that's not great because each individual Lambda is going to be responsible for a different thing. And that's where we leverage that plugin to make sure that we're not giving too wide permissions to everything. AWS account isolation to limit blast radius. This has gone wrong a few times, and we've seen it, and I'm sure everyone watching has done something like this too. You want to separate your accounts by stage. So dev, test, QA, prod, UAT, whatever it's called. And also separate by developer as well, which is very helpful. And then, of course, for sensitive workloads like PCI, for payment card information, you want to just take everything that's responsible for, like, that touches any PCI stuff and just move that to a completely separate isolated account and have the most compliance, most security, all that stuff. And that helps for downstream audits. We helped a enterprise company do a PCI workload with serverless back in late 2020. And that was a big lift that we were helping with. And we had to make sure that everything was isolated. And so even if it's part of another service, you have to find those cuts, isolate it from there. Getting into kind of authentication as well. JWT authentication with Cognito and granular scoped user permissions. So you can do things like Cognito user groups, and you can limit down using like Cognito identity pools to have both authenticated, unauthenticated access, and then use the JWTs to kind of send that stuff back and forth. Also a service called AWS config. So this was shout out to Mohammed from the Serverless Guru team for this one. So you can create rules for compliance, and then you get notified if anything is off. And so that's really helpful. We implement that at an enterprise client as well, related to the PCI stuff. And then finally here, we have ensure that the app code user data access is locked by user ID, org ID, or some other type of thing here. And the reason why I put this one in is that there is still, it's a shared responsibility model, and you still carry some of the responsibility for that, obviously. So when you are making like data requests to your database, you want to make sure that you have filters on there so that whatever that user ID could be coming from the JWT, just make sure that it's locked down so that if a bad request did come in, it's not able to access data outside of that user, right? And so that limits it down, but that's something on the app code side that we need to watch for as well. And yeah, that's it for my side. Kind of powered through that one a little bit faster, just because I know that we're over time at the moment. Thing that I want to flag here again is, we're from 10 different countries here for Serverless Guru. So if y'all ever need anything, please let us know. Let me stop share. Okay. Is there any questions that we have?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of ones in the Q&A section.
Okay. Awesome. Let's see. Okay, here's one. How could I best encourage my developers who have experience with programming languages that work well with serverless to experiment with it? Yeah, I mean, one cool thing you could do is a hackathon. So one thing that Tobias talked about was an Alexa skill. I actually learned how to work with serverless using an Alexa skill. And so I built one, and it's very small. It's very easy to get going. You could probably set one up in like a day or two. And it's just something where you get your feet wet with Lambda and the AWS SDK and some of the other elements of that. And just based on things like that, you might be able to spark some stuff. Also, something that's more towards like getting to maybe a more service development side and not just purely a hackathon for fun is you could just take a small service and then just try to roll that out. So take your Node.js code that's already existing and try to build it out with Lambda and API gateway and so on, or try to rewrite something from scratch. So I think either one of those things, I think what people will be surprised with is that there is like a barrier of entry when you're learning these things. But what's really nice is that now like the first like 4 or 5 steps of that has been pretty matured over the past like 3 years. And so if you are familiar with Node.js or Python or a language like that, I would just say just jump straight in and then give them like space and time away from their work and responsibility to fully focus on that. Because that's probably the biggest stressor for developers is when they're asked to do things that they don't actually have time to do because, and that I have to deal with all the time because we have client work and then we have other stuff that we want to do. And then the client work is where the stress comes from. And so how do you balance that? And so as long as like leadership is being very clear that like Friday, no client work, no answering emails about any of your normal job functions, you're just going to experiment with something new for the long-term future of the company. That would be my answer there.
Awesome. Somebody asked if you'd also share the script that you worked on.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, so I've been working on kind of a skunkworks project for a little bit for the past few months. I don't have any full announcements on that yet, but it's part of that like little thing. So once we get closer to like releasing it, that script will come out and I'll make sure to hype it up. And so if you follow Serverless Guru on Twitter, you'll see that that get posted. And so, yeah.
Awesome. Exciting stuff.
Awesome. Okay. I think we had maybe like one more question we could do. I think this was for Tobias. Are your Lambdas being accessed through API gateway or are you using ALB instead? That one might have been for you.
Yeah, I think that there's another one, but for this one, no, we're not using VPC actually, because like when we started with this, like putting Lambdas into VPCs was kind of horrible because of this ENI provisioning requirement in the first place. So it added like 10 seconds of startup times, and then AWS refactored this 2019 with AWS Hyperplane. So it just adds 1 or 2 seconds of startup times. But because of all of our Lambda function were customer facing, this 1 or 2 seconds are like just, we can't take it. So all of our Lambda function are just running out of the VPCs, but we're having no requirements for Elasticache or something. Like no other AWS services which are just running in the VPC are needed. So that's working perfectly fine because everything is IAM secured, so works out nice. And there's another one about the weighted alias. Yeah, just like Ryan told, like this canary deployments and blue-green deployments, it's nothing out of the box. I think it's out of the box with this new AWS service Proton, but I didn't try it out, and it wasn't out there since a few months ago. So we started to do this, like this traffic shifting with the weighted alias. How can you do this? You can just deploy new versions of your Lambda functions with some separated alias, and then you can do traffic shifting with the API gateway to the new version, like 10 or 20%. And in the next like few minutes or few hours, we're just having a look at the logs if there are some spikes and errors. And if everything looks normal, we're just switching the complete alias to the new version. So it's just, if you're rolling out a somehow broken version, we're not affecting all of the customers, but just like a few of them. And if something's not working out, we can switch back easily. But it's nothing you get easily out of the box. Like, we're working a lot with Terraform, and like coupling infrastructure deployments and code deployments for the Lambda function are probably not the best way to go. Yeah, that's it.
Awesome. Okay. And I guess we have one more, and then we can wrap. Appreciate everyone staying back for a little bit. Maybe Tavi, you can take this one. So I've watched Alexa skills are always recommended for people starting serverless development. What other easy to learn skills would you recommend? Do you have any of those?
Yeah, I think like it's not too hard to build like an hello world or something that's basic and build your way up from there. And I think, as you mentioned, like hackathons or just like getting a small project up and running, migrating something over that you already have that's existing. Those are really good ways to start and learn the ropes. Yeah, I don't know.
Awesome. Okay. All right. Awesome. Well, yeah. Let's go ahead and wrap. I guess like Tavi, Tobias, do you have any like final thoughts before we close this one out?
Nothing from me. Thank you for coming, everyone. Yeah, it was super nice.
Yeah, same for me. Like, awesome experience, because it's like the first webinar for me, like talking about serverless and all these things. So I was pretty excited also to be with Ryan and Tavi. So yeah, thanks to all attendees.
Awesome. Cool. All right. Well, let's call that a successful webinar done. Thank you to the Dashbird team. Thank you for everybody in attendance, and stay tuned for everything from Dashbird to Serverless Guru. If you have any other questions, drop it in Twitter, and I'm sure all of us will get back to you. Appreciate it, and enjoy the rest of y'all's day.
Awesome. See ya.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.